Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Allen, and I'm a member of the Indigenous Solidarity Working Group here at Church of the Redeemer. I say welcome to all of you for attending this afternoon's lecture, and a welcome to those who are joining us on YouTube for this lecture by Professor Douglas Sanderson. His talk is being taped and will be available after our session this afternoon to watch. If you've not been to Redeemer before, the washrooms are at the back of the church and on my right. I'm going to introduce our MC for the afternoon, Mary Pat Moore. Educated at the University of Toronto and Osgoode Hall, Mary Pat was senior counsel at the Ministry of the Attorney General before she retired. She said her favorite experience at law school was the Indigenous experiential course taught by Professor John Boros and Shin Imai. Mary Pat is an active member of the Church of the Redeemer, and as an active volunteer, she has chaired numerous boards, and she's honored to be asked to facilitate our time together this afternoon. Mary Pat.
If I was an Indigenous person, I would tell a joke that put me in the shadow, but I'm not Indigenous and I'm not a joke teller, so I'm not going to go there. This afternoon, just before I introduce Professor Sanderson, I want to draw your attention to two mics, and if you'll come up and line up and ask your questions for Professor Sanderson, he'll be speaking for about 30 minutes or so. We'll have a discussion, and when the discussion's done, there will be coffee and cookies for us at the back. So, as you know, the title today is Indigenous is the New Orientalism, Identity, Ambiguity, and the Creation of Pretendians. I'm just delighted to introduce Professor Douglas Sanderson. Professor Sanderson is the Prichard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy, Decanal Advisor on Indigenous Issues in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, and he is the member of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. Professor Sanderson's research areas include Aboriginal and Indigenous theory, as well as private law, primarily property law, and public and private legal theory. Moving beyond the framework of common law property rights and constitutional land treaty rights, his scholarship focuses on Aboriginal institutions, post-colonial reconciliation, and rebuilding community. Professor Sanderson's current research interests include the peace and friendship treaties from 1600 to 1763 and the fur trade in Canada. As many of you know, Professor Sanderson is the co-author, along with Andrew Stobo Snyderman, of The Valley of the Birdtail, an Indian reserve, a white town, and the road to reconciliation. I want to welcome all the members of what I think of as Pamela Thompson and my book club for Valley of the Birdtail. And in passing, I just want to give recognition to Pam's tremendous leadership, not only for the Indigenous Solidarity Working Group, but somehow attracting Professor Sanderson to be our legal scholar related to Indigenous issues. Thank you, Pam. This book, The Valley of the Birdtail, has been named in a number of awards. Professor Sanderson told me that his favorite one is the High Plains Award from the library in Billings, Montana. And he said the book is recognized on its merit, and you don't have to be Indigenous or Canadian to enjoy the quality of the book. So I'd like to say a word about the process for the afternoon. And as I mentioned, I went over what we're going to do. But at this point, in addition to welcoming Professor Sanderson by words myself, I'd like to ask Stephen Allen to come up and present a pouch of tobacco to Professor Sanderson. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. It's always a pleasure to come to the Church of the Redeemer. I too think of it as my book club. So in the past, when I've been here, I have spoken largely about history, and last time about the way in which grief and grieving can influence ideas around reconciliation. And so today I want to talk more broadly in a slightly meandering discussion, but I'll try and bring it all together. I was going to talk about my book, but in the interest of time, I will just, if there is time, I will talk about it a little bit. I will also let you know that there are half dozen or so copies of the book here if anyone's interested in purchasing one. And let me get into the meat of the discussion then. Indigenous is the new Orientalism. So my children, who are here today, Ursa and Otis, there we are, like most children, did not have naturally curious taste buds. As kids, they liked macaroni and cheese and not much else. But one thing that they did like was those instant soup noodles. You know, the ones where you add the boiling water to the dried noodles and then the flavor pouch. And voila, hot noodles and broth. In my house, we called them long noodles so as to distinguish them from the other edible noodle, macaroni. Now, if you've been to an Asian grocery store lately, you will see entire aisles dedicated to instant noodles. Flavor varieties that seem endless, and without actually being able to read Chinese or Japanese, I have no idea what these flavors even are. Though I once saw a documentary about taste scientists going up into the mountains of Chinese villages and extracting the smell from their cooking pots so that they could reproduce it in a lab. So if you could read the labels, you would find almost any flavor you wanted, no matter how exotic or remote the original taste was. So my son Otis loved and still rather enjoys the long noodles, and we in practice over the years have stuck to the Mr. Noodles brand. The reason for this is that Mr. Noodles has, among their many flavor profiles, a particular flavor that is my son's favorite, and that flavor is Oriental. It's Oriental flavored. And so, of course, one day Otis turns to me and says, "What is Oriental anyways?" Which is a good question, because it's not soy sauce flavored, or ginger, or sesame, or miso. It's Oriental. Indeed, the question, what is Oriental, was the subject of considerable examination and explication by the Columbia-based late 20th century scholar Edward Said. And I will say more about this later, but for now, let's placeholder our discussion of Orientalism. Now, at about the same age as Otis was when he asked his revelatory question, what is Orientalism, I was at the same age asking a similar kind of question. You see, my mother was born and registered as a status Indian, while my father, an Ojibwe from the Dog Creek Reserve with a good mix of Métis blood to boot, my father was never a status Indian. He was never legally registered. My parents met, and they fell in love, and they married, and then one day my mother got a letter from the Department of Indian Affairs. Now, under the Indian Act as it was then, when a status woman married a non-status man, that woman lost her status. She was deregistered as an Indian. And so that was the letter my mother received. She was deregistered. Years later, a court case based on obvious gender discrimination resulted in changes to the Indian Act, such that my mother was suddenly re-registered as an Indian. And my sister and I were, poof, just like that, we were added to the treaty rolls, and we became official legal Indians. But what did that mean? Now, my parents' generation whole experience of being Indian was tied up in residential schools for my mother, the foster care system for my father, and the shame of those experiences meant that they never shared the extent of their endurance. They were silent, and whatever being an Indian was tightly bound up for them with the horror of their childhoods. So Indianness and what it meant, Creeness, what that meant, was something we never talked about. But one day I had an idea. I found that letter from Indian Affairs. I rummaged through my mother's papers, found it, fished it out, and with that, I had a mailing address. This was still the 1980s. If the Department of Indian Affairs, I reasoned, if they could make me an Indian, surely they could tell me what it meant to be an Indian. So I took to my typewriter. I dashed off some correspondence explaining that I had just become an Indian. I'm 14 years old, living in Quesnel, British Columbia, and I don't know what that means. And could someone in the department please just explain it to me? The weeks passed slowly. And then one day a large envelope arrived addressed to me from Ottawa. And the envelope didn't just contain a letter, I could feel its heft. And I tore it open and found a curt letter from someone in the departmental correspondence unit of the Department of Indian Affairs indicating that enclosed was a reply to my inquiry. And attached to that letter was a copy of the Indian Act. In some ways, my relationship to the Indian Act and its text has stretched over many decades. So what does it mean to be an Indian? Well, there's a way in which that question is easier to answer than one might think, if only because Indian comes with its own built-in legal definition. Or rather, we can deploy at least one definition of what it is to be Indian by reference to statute. To be this kind of Indian, the legal kind, is to be the kind of Indian who is eligible to be entered into the treaty rolls maintained by the Department of Indian Affairs, or whatever it is they're calling themselves these days. Now that in turn means that you meet legal definitions colloquially known as the two-grandmother rule. That's often how people talk about the nature of the cutoff for Indian status, the two-grandmother rule. 2 kukums make you potentially eligible to be an Indian, 1 kukum and you're like my father, Indian enough, but not Indian enough to be a status legal Indian. The legal definition, therefore, creates a second category of Indian, the non-status Indian. Every bit as Indian as the status Indian, but with no legal recognition, no entry into the treaty rolls, no corresponding Aboriginal or treaty rights. When it comes to Métis and Inuit people, we also have tests to see if people who claim Métis or Inuit identity can also exercise Métis and Inuit rights that non-legal Métis and Inuit people cannot. For the Métis, the Supreme Court has set out a test called the Pauli test, and the Inuit are identified according to a statute. Both the tests for Métis and Inuit identity turn on having to do with recognition with a traditional community, participation in that present-day community, and a kind of continuity between the past and the present. So together, these 3 peoples, Indian, Inuit, and Métis, are collectively known as the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 defines Aboriginal people as including Indian, Inuit, and Métis. And so in some sense, it's actually not possible for a person to be Aboriginal, because properly used, the term Aboriginal refers to all three groups at once. Now, I'll say more about Métis rights towards the end of my talk, and let me focus here on the rights of status Indians. Now, there are, of course, in some very real sense, at least in a cultural sense, no Indians, because Indian is sort of a catch-all phrase used by the Department of Indian Affairs. What there are distinct native nations, First Nations, we might even say, and these nations have members. I myself am a member of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, as are my children. So you can see there's already kind of a disconnect between the idea of Indianness and the instantiation of Indianness in something that I would call Cree identity. There's not a clean overlap between Indian and Cree. And because Cree culture is vastly different than Haida or Mohawk culture, the term Indian is very loosely fitting. There's a great deal of slippage between the word and the idea of being an Indian and the reality of being a Cree or a Haida or a Mohawk person. Moreover, the term Indian was never satisfactory to Indians themselves. It's too generic. The word Indian captures nothing that is unique about my Cree heritage or culture or traditions. And the very word Indian arose simply from Columbus's profound misunderstanding that the lands he encountered were not, in fact, actually India and its residents Indians. But it caught. So as a term, Indian was never good, but the Constitution, as I mentioned, uses the term Aboriginal to define Aboriginal as including Indian. Now, there is also, and so we have a way of referring to these peoples, and that is to use the phrase Aboriginal. But Aboriginal has, over the years, come to sound colonial, and so the term quickly fell into disfavor, except among lawyers who use the term in its proper constitutional context. Somehow, slowly at first, and then more quickly, a new term came into proper usage, the term Indigenous. Indigenous wasn't Aboriginal, Indigenous wasn't Indian, Indigenous was something else. But what exactly? What does it mean to be Indigenous? And this is where I want to get back to my son Otis asking me a much harder question than I think he realized: what is Oriental? Over the course of centuries, the British Empire expanded to include a significant portion of the world's peoples, and mostly these were brown peoples from India and Sri Lanka and Africa and North America and Australia and New Zealand. These were not cultures or peoples anything like the British. These brown people ate different foods and wore different clothes and spoke different languages and prayed to different gods. And this British Empire was also an Enlightenment empire, an empire of geography, but also an empire of the mind. An empire that grew into, and as a result of scientific inquiry, plants, animals, languages, people, they could all be categorized, systematized, and made the subject of methodological scrutiny. Think, for example, of the Victorian obsession with butterflies. English collectors, professional and amateur, scoured the forests and jungles of the world seeking out new subspecies to pin to their display boards, catalog, and in so doing, impose on those same forests and jungles a particularly English shape and meaning. When it came to the study of the empire's various brown peoples, then, there developed an entirely new field of study: Orientalism. Orientalism was a field of academic study in Victorian England. It was the study of the people and the cultures and the language and the history of the Orient. Distinguished professors made their careers writing volumes on the particular cultural habits of this or that Oriental people. A whole industry of study emerged, the vestiges of which we see today only in museums and Indiana Jones movies. In the 1970s and 1980s, the cultural anthropologist Edward Said turned the Orientalist gaze inward, applying the frameworks of academic anthropology not to the people and the cultures of the Orient, but to those academics who had constructed for themselves the whole field of Orientalism. Said came to see that Orientalism was nothing more than a projection. There was no Orient. There was only an English conception of difference, an English conception of culture, of language, of family, of history. And that system included classifications, just as butterflies, roses could be gathered from all over the world and then divided into specialized cultures, so too could the cultures and peoples of the world be understood within this projection of English order and meaning. Orientalism and the Orient were, Said demonstrated, nothing more meaningful than the flavor package of seasoning labeled Oriental on my son's Mr. Noodles. The Orient was nothing more than a projection of meaning. Now, I've taken us down this rather long detour to the history of cultural anthropology for a reason, because as I have struggled to understand what it means to be indigenous, I have consistently fallen back to thinking about Orientalism. To be indigenous isn't to be Cree or Haida or Mohawk. Indigenous, like the term Indian, doesn't really fit over the top of the peoples or cultures to which words like Indian and Indigenous are applied. But Indian, remember, Indian, for all its faults, has a definite legal meaning. Indigenous, as a category, lacks the certainty inherent with using the term Indian. And so, given a lack of precise meaning attached to the word indigenous, what happens? It seems to me that what happens is that the newfound category of indigenous peoples is suddenly up for definition. People begin to think of themselves as belonging not to any particular First Nation culture or tradition. Instead, people begin to embrace their indigenous identity. And what is that indigenous identity? Like the academic study of Orientalism in the last century, indigenous has become a category open not merely to definition, but to self-definition. Is it any wonder that we have seen a rapid rise in the outing of non-First Nations people claiming indigenous identity? We see this in the worlds of academia and the arts and politics. The very existence and broad use of the term indigenous has allowed a large number of people to pretend to assert an authentic indigenous culture or heritage. Indigenous as a category has become something very much like Orientalism, not a real thing at all, but instead a category based on the ill-founded projections of non-First Nations people operating as though they had a legitimate indigenous identity. So I want to shift gears here just a little bit to begin thinking through some of the implications of my talk so far. What makes an Aboriginal right legitimate? Why are some claims made by some Aboriginal peoples, Métis, Inuit, and Indian peoples? Why are some of those claims to rights recognized by the courts or by the Crown and vindicated by the courts, and others are not? Well, one key aspect of an Aboriginal rights claim is that the right claimed is not new. Almost by definition, Aboriginal rights have to have some connection with one's ancestors. That is, the right in the present day has to be rooted in the continuity of ancestors. And in the case of First Nations people, that right is said to be grounded in ancestral practice dating from time immemorial. So rights like the right to hunt and fish or hunt this kind of deer in this region, this has continuity with one's ancestors hunting the same kind of deer in the same place. And that right to hunt is authorized by that person's community. Note then that there's two rights really operating here. One is the community's right to regulate itself, to govern itself, to regulate activities within its territory, to pass laws about that or norms. And this right of governance, like the right to hunt, is grounded in generations of practice, underlined by the failure of any other government to explicitly legislate away this ancient right of self-governance. So that's the general structure of an Aboriginal right. The right is an activity, and that includes the activity of governance to authorize the right. Now, this doesn't mean that new activities couldn't become Aboriginal rights. For example, hunting now happens with rifles and snowmobiles rather than dog teams and bows, but there remains a continuity of practice. Now, nothing in what I have just said changes in any substantial way the position of First Nations people. Their rights regime is rooted in activities with an ancestral connection to time immemorial. And there is nothing in there to threaten Inuit rights. They can and should have the same foundation as First Nation rights, namely activities with an ancestral connection to time immemorial. Métis rights, however, flounder under this conception. By definition, Métis identity is a thing that comes into existence at some point in time. There is a world with no Métis people, and then the next day, there's Métis people. Academics call this process ethnogenesis, the birth of a cultural people. And because Métis people at the point of ethnogenesis are the offspring of French and Indian peoples, Métis-ness can only become a thing once we have French and Indian people coming into sufficiently sustained contact to develop the deep familial and linguistic ties which together make the Métis what they are, something different than Indian, not French, something new. The Métis language, Michif, is itself a combination of French and Cree, Ojibwe and English. It's made of constituent parts, but assembled into a new form. But notice that unlike First Nations and Inuit peoples, Métis rights do not connect in the same way. Because Métis rights cannot have an origin until there's a Métis people to exercise those rights. Now, it's going to become important to think about the nature of these rights. Remember I said that a First Nations right to hunt was really the right to be authorized to hunt by one's government, one's First Nations government, and one right then begets the other. You get the right to authorize hunting, you get the right to the activity of hunting. And so you can see that what we have is a group right, the right to govern your community, set your laws, advance your particular cultural vision of the good life, and also an individual right, a right to engage in the activity authorized by your First Nations government. Now, Métis rights seemingly lack this structure. The Métis government as a group rights holder doesn't exist until Métis people exist, and so there can't be a connection to ancient ancestral Métis practices because Métis people have an ethnogenesis within the past few hundred years. Now, it might be the case that some historic Métis persons have been personally authorized to hunt in this area or that area by a First Nations collective. That is, the First Nations government has authorized the individual actions of a Métis hunter. But note how this version of the right does not include any authority from a Métis collective, because that collective just can't ground any rights that attach to prior generations. So let's run through this again for clarity before moving on to solutions. Okay, so First Nations and Inuit rights consist of two parts: a group right to governance and to authorize activities, just like the province can authorize a speed limit of 100 kilometers or 120 kilometers an hour. And those same First Nations and Inuit governments can authorize specific individuals to do things like hunt in particular areas. And then those hunters exercise individual rights. So group rights authorize practice of individual rights. And so my concern with Métis rights is that at present there is no Métis group or collective to allocate that group right. There are only Métis people to exercise the right. Let me be more clear. It's not that there's not a present-day Métis collective government like the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's that the Métis governments of today have no connection to an ancestral, since time immemorial Métis community. And that community's ancestral connection is what legitimizes First Nation and Inuit rights. Now, I don't want it to sound like I don't believe that Métis rights exist in the present day. They exist, and I believe they exist. But the foundation of Métis rights has to be located somewhere other than ancient Métis communities, because those communities don't exist. In other words, we have to find a different but viable route to ground Métis rights today. And I should add here that the issue of Métis rights has long been a source of quiet concern for First Nations scholars, activists, and leaders. Speaking for the First Nations people I know and to whom I am related, I can say that we have long been skeptical of Métis rights in general, but of Métis land rights in particular. And while this tension has simmered in the background for decades, in recent months, this tension has come to the foreground in the form of very troubling and very angry communications between the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the Métis Nation of Ontario, with the former asserting that any recognition of Métis Nation is a usurpation of First Nation rights over traditional territory. The fight has become very public very quickly. And I think the reason that that has happened is because it had simmered in the background for many, many years. But Indian leaders and First Nations people, we want to be good allies to our Métis brethren. They are, after all, our cousins. And so no one said anything. We were skeptical, but we just let it play out. And when the stakes was a moose here or a moose there, whatever. Let it go. But once Métis people began asserting rights to land and to territory, First Nations people began to put their hands up. Now that Métis leaders are talking about rights to land and about traditional Métis territories, now has come the time to think more clearly about what grounds those Métis rights and how we might justify the governance of those rights. So here is one way, and I think maybe the right way forward. And this idea comes to me from a Métis scholar named Stephen Mussel. Mussel has long been concerned with the court's conceptions of Métis rights. He felt that it was both hollow, in that the rights weren't grounded like First Nations and Inuit rights connected to a long ancestry, and that when the courts recognize Métis rights, that can have the effect of effacing or redistributing rights that properly rest with First Nations groups. And one thing Mussel notes is that we have arrived in this mess because the court's early articulation of Métis rights was not bound in any actual historical account. The case R.V. Powley, as the first and foundational Métis rights case is named, Powley set out a test that did not pay any attention to the relationship between Métis litigant communities and those of the surrounding First Nations. Now, Mussel asserts, and I think rightly, that a hard look at the historical data reveals Métis communities living among First Nations communities, who are on lands that they have governed since time immemorial. Mussel contends that to the extent Métis people exercised hunting rights over those territory, those rights had to have been granted by the local First Nation. In other words, on this account, the federal government has no place recognizing Métis groups or rights or organizations, and certainly no place handing out ancient and ancestral rights. To the extent those rights flow to the Métis people, and I believe they do, the only way that makes sense is if those rights flow through First Nations, who are the legitimate governing authority of those territories, and so represent the only means through which Aboriginal rights to hunt can be granted or recognized. The Crown has never retained for itself the ancestral native rights to hunt, and therefore the Crown is in no position to award these rights to anyone other than First Nations communities and governments. From there, Métis people can and should make the case that they have rights that flow from these First Nations territories and authorities. But again, this is no business for the Crown or the courts, at least not in the first instance. Taking this position does not deny Métis rights. Instead, the idea of derivative Métis rights provides a sound historical and legal basis for the contemporary assertion of Métis rights to hunt and fish, and to engage in a potentially wide range of activities, including hunting and fishing for foods, gathering traditional medicines, and even potentially the right to a moderate livelihood from those same activities. But the extent and scope of those rights is a matter of negotiation between the local Métis community and the First Nation in whose traditional territory that Métis community resides. And I should say that we're lucky to have a historical model of some of these authorities in action. The Red River Métis, in and around what is now Winnipeg, were involved in an 1817 agreement known as the Selkirk Treaty. It was the first treaty to be signed in what became Manitoba. In that treaty agreement, resident First Nations ceded land to what was actually called a settler reservation. It was the First Nations ceding land that would be reserved for settlers. And within the governance structure of that settlement, that government created property interests for Métis citizens. The Crown allocated much of the land of the Selkirk Treaty for Métis settlement, but the actual allotment process, the distribution of those land rights, was greatly flawed. And the previously recognized Métis land entitlements were then swept up by unscrupulous officials. There became an active market for the sale of Métis lands, and very, very little land made it into the hands of the Red River Métis. But in that case, where the First Nation has ceded land to the Crown and where that land was set aside but never transferred to the Métis, then the Red River Métis at least have every right to seek a return of their land, of their property, that which was promised to them and never delivered. And they have every right to make that claim against the Crown, who failed in its duties. What legitimizes the Red River Métis claim to land and other rights as the present day is a connection with, is rather a historical connection with a First Nation ceding territory for that Métis settlement. So there, in the Red River Basin, it seems that the Métis can make out their strongest claims. Métis are a new people, just as Indigenous is a new term. Without legal guardrails on meaning, Indigenous is a kind of Orientalism, a projection of cultural meaning and not an actual culture or people. First Nations and Inuit people ground their meaning, what it means to be Haida or Cree or one of the distinct Inuit dialects. These people's history defines their meaning and gives some sense of how to balance their ancient rights against contemporary claims. The claims of present-day Métis people can be legitimized and given shape by recognizing that Métis claims must, to be grounded as rights, must flow through an authorizing First Nation. Now, in closing out my remarks, let me be clear that people should be free to assert whatever kind of identity they choose. In the purely social realm, people should have this freedom, even though it can lead to all kinds of conflicts. And I'm thinking here about those Indian chief or squaw Halloween costumes. That's clearly an appropriation. It's clearly wrong. People who feel that they have a connection to Aboriginal cultures through some deep ancestral connection are not wrong. They really do feel that. And there's really nothing wrong with feeling that way, even though I personally find it a little disturbing. About 6 months ago, I went to a friend's house, and he had a visitor there from Hungary. He was there with his son. He's an anthropologist of some sort. And he was so excited to meet me. So excited to meet me. They'd come all the way to Canada, not to meet me particularly, but to meet Indians. And this guy sat across from me at this kitchen table and explained to me that his people actually have a deep ancestral connection to my people. And the way he rationalized that was he told me that the Hungarian language is distinct from other European language groups. It's more similar to a sort of like Bering Strait language group. And that means that Indians are really just Hungarians, and that what has happened is that the church has corrupted the true Indian identity of the Hungarian peoples. Now, I sat there and but what do I have to fall back on? Like, you believe that, and that's okay. Like, people can believe whatever they want. The problem is when you start asserting that identity, right, in a way that starts to take up space. When strong feelings of connection with an Indigenous culture make people assert a kind of do-it-yourself, piece from here, piece from there, Indigenous identity. And indeed, our deployment, and sometimes our insistence that you use the term Indigenous, has created the space for the projection of culture onto the bare edifice of a single word, Indigenous. And that word alone cannot stand as a substitute for the recognized political authority of many First Nations, Inuit, and even Métis governments. Packages of Mr. Noodles aside, we have largely phased out the term Oriental. Edward Said had pointed out to us that to the extent Orientalism was a thing, it was a thing entirely constructed by the West and stood without relation to the people who were described as Oriental. I think it's time we do the same and phase out the term Indigenous because it serves no purpose and describes no rights-bearing community. Indigenous is a new Orientalism, and we ought to recognize it for what it is, a fog of meaning, open to exploitation, and putting at risk the legitimate claims of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. Thank you, miigwech.
So let's just test it works. So I'm happy, Professor Sanderson is happy to entertain questions, but you may want to start with comments. Oh, what a quiet crowd. Well, why don't you, we'll ask a question about your confusion. Pardon?
So that's, Oh, yeah, it is, yeah. It was not on, so I took it off.
Please go ahead. You have a question.
No, I don't want to speak for the woman who said we're confused, but I think that we're all kind of, oh, here I am, the white settler, who always wants to be extremely careful about how I refer to First Nations people. I'm kind of left with thinking maybe I just talk about First Nations people. I can remember thinking, oh, I'm going to talk about Indigenous, or no, the word's Aboriginal, and never knowing quite what is the appropriate word. And then I would hear First Nations people talking to each other and calling themselves Indian, and I thought, yeah, they can do that, but I can't call them Indian. And I mean, this is just a wee tiny part of what you've said, because overall it was fantastic, and it's far more, it's about far more than my need as a white settler to know what it is that I now have to call you people. So please help us figure that out.
So thank you for that question. And it's not your fault, right? Like, as I said at the end, there has been this really strong political desire among Aboriginal peoples to move away from terms that we found to be colonial. And so we sort of introduced this new word and then actually insisted that everyone use it, right? Like, it's partly, the reason people use the term Indigenous is because at some point someone said Aboriginal and some Indigenous person went, that's not the right term. So what is the right term? Well, I did manage to go through that 40-minute talk without ever referring to Indigenous peoples, except in a sort of offhanded way. And I used terms like First Nations, I used Aboriginal, and I think the problem is that Indigenous, or as a category, like, it includes too much, right? And so when we're talking about a wide, like, whenever we can, of course, we should ground our discussions in the names of actual peoples or even language groups as a way of grouping them together. I think First Nations is acceptable as sort of a political term, because what we're describing when we talk about First Nations is not any particular cultural group. We're talking about the political authority of Aboriginal peoples. So First Nations seems to work for me. I tried Native for a little while a couple weeks ago, and it was okay. It felt all right. So honestly, I think, and I'm ashamed to say that I did not include it in my speech because I forgot how to pronounce it. Maybe Otis, would you come up here and pronounce? I think, like, the actual French term.
The term is autochtone, but you said it autochtone when you first said it.
Yes, autochtone.
Yeah, autochtone. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, in French it means emerging from the earth.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, if we had to come up with a replacement for Indigenous, that's the one that I think that I would pick. Though we actually don't need a new term. Like, Aboriginal, First Nation, Métis, Inuit, Cree, Haida, like, those all work. They do all of the work we need them to do. The introduction of the new term Indigenous is what creates that space that other people can step into. And I think that's what starts to create the problem of pretend Indians, is the creation of that space through the utilization of the term Indigenous.
So there's a question at the back, but please come to the mic and line up if you'd like to ask a question. Come ahead, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And your answer to this question actually answered a lot of my question, but I want to take it a little bit further and ask, are you trying to encourage our conversations to move much more into the sphere of individual First Nation conversations? This nation, a conversation with Cree nations, a conversation with Mohawk nations, because in order to have productivity in the conversations, do we need to start, are you asking us to start becoming much more specific in our conversations with specific nations, specific cultures, specific histories?
Yeah, I think that's basically it. Yeah, we're usually talking about a specific either peoples or the way those peoples form together in some fashion. So First Nations is forming together in some fashion, and Cree is how people form themselves. So I guess, like, if we were in Europe, right, like, we have this broad term Europeans, right? But where we can, we talk about Danes and French and Germans, and then we even talk about them regionally, Saxony, et cetera. And I guess I want the same kind of linguistic terminal respect accorded to Indian nations as we do to European ones. I mean, they have distinct geographic locations. Sometimes they are hard to pronounce. But I think we can all learn, just as I'm trying to do with my son Otis. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure, I'm not catching the European reference very well, but
Yeah, it's like European is like the term Aboriginal, right? Like, we don't feel the need to introduce a new term to describe, like, some region of Europe. We just talk about Italy, right? And so I think to the extent that here in Canada we can talk about Mohawk and Haudenosaunee and Mi'kmaq cultures and peoples, that's how we should do it. It's kind of lazy to not do it, right?
Right.
And also, if we want to be lazy about it, there's a word to do it, and that's Aboriginal, and it has a distinct legal meaning, and it includes all of those peoples. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, your question.
That actually really dovetails very well with my question, which was, so what, if I'm hearing you rightly, Aboriginal has a legal definition, but Indigenous does not.
That's right.
Okay, all right, because I thought that they were similar in that people could claim to be Aboriginal without actually being Aboriginal, or, you know, having one great-great-great-great-grandparent who was, you know, apparently Cree, but they have no record of that, and they have no connection to the nation, but I'm Aboriginal.
Yeah,
but they can't do that. Okay.
So I think those claims tend to be I'm Indigenous rather than I'm Aboriginal. Because Aboriginal, like the Indian part, actually attaches to real communities with, you know, actual histories. Indigenous opens up the space for, like, I feel strongly about this, but it's not an actual thing, right? It's hard to do. Like, it took me a while to not write Indigenous when I was writing this thing, to be honest. Like, it's tough to come to a new term. But it's sort of about a kind of clarity about what we're really talking about, right? And you know, as a legal scholar, I'm interested in ensuring that, you know, to the extent that people have rights, that those rights make sense. And one of the things that has obscured those rights, I think, has been an obfuscation or an obscuring of the people who are making those claims.
Right.
Okay. And as my wife points out, the problem with, you know, people who are asserting their Indigenous identities is that they often look more Indian than Indians, right? I think Tanya said something like, it looks like Etsy exploded on them, right? Like, they've got the earrings and like they super get into it. And they sort of affirm our stereotypes, right? Like, that's what makes this really complicated, is that often the people who we think look most Indigenous are not Aboriginal at all. They're merely asserting this identity and covering it with all of the right kind of accessory. They're accessorizing Indianness in the right kind of ways.
Right.
Like, if you were to look at me, I'm not sure you'd go like, there's the obvious Indian, that guy right there, right? So by creating this new term, we've created this space that people can occupy, and they often occupy it in a really, you know, Indian positive way, like with having adopted all of the crafts and et cetera. I just think that that's not, I think that that's also okay.
But not if they're wanting to claim that they can.
That's
hunt
right.
and
Like,
fish
once you
and
start trying to
land
claim
and stuff.
rights or entitlements, like, that's where the problem is. So the Hungarian guy, like, that's weird, but it's not harming anyone. It's not taking away from anything. So I just kind of nodded.
Okay, well, thanks. I think it's sometimes helpful, speaking as somebody who, you know, tries to advance different, you know, justice issues and whatnot, to have a word to distinguish people whose ancestors were here from time immemorial from people like me whose ancestors were not here from time immemorial. And we can't use Canadian or American or North American.
Yeah, I think First Nations does
yeah.
most of that work.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for exploring the ambiguity of the term Indigenous. Great question. A question at the back, and then Patrick, you'll be next.
Right, yeah, I'm Eddie. European situation that you described, in the last 5 to 10 years, I suddenly thought more about something I was asked to do as part of a geography exercise back in university days. And in fact, that's where, with Tito as a dictator, you have Yugoslavia, but you have Serbs, Croats, and whatever other peoples within the mix, and they're still battling between themselves and working well with themselves on certain things as in the present environment. You know, the whole of...
Do you have a specific question for?
Well, no, I was just saying that your Europeanism and that and what happens here between what you might call particular nations. Anyway.
I think your example is quite interesting in that, you know, specifically within that Balkan region, it was the covering up of those identities of Serbian, Bosnian, Croatian, and the uniform covering them with the term Yugoslavian, right? That's what allowed all of those tensions to simmer, all of those identities that were not being realized or celebrated or recognized. And so, you know, I think that there's some danger, actually, as your example points out, in our covering over those, you know, those distinct First Nations identities by using, and we're doing it in a really simple way. We're just doing it linguistically, right? We're just by using words, we're looping all those peoples together in a way that I'm sure they don't appreciate any more than the Bosnians did. Thank you.
Patrick?
I really like First Nations, and I'd like to spin a bit on that, and you can help me spin it. Because First Nations suggests that, in fact, there are sovereign nations that are worthy of self-government. And it seems to me that we've been skirting around, and the government's been skirting around this issue for many, many years, the issue of real sovereignty for the First Nations. And I'd like you to comment on where you think this is going to go in the future, and are we going to really have a nation-to-nation relationship? Because to me, that's at the basis of reconciliation. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you for the comment and the question. I mean, but what needs to happen for a nation-to-nation relationship to be recognized and realized is that what that actually is a government-to-government relationship, right? And so, you know, I'll also admit I have a little problem with the term First Nations, right? In the way that it conveys nationness. If only because my own community, the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, like we're 1,400 people. Like we're not much of a nation. And in fact, like realistically, we would not be able to exercise national style governance. There's not enough of us to, for example, assess the suitability of a mining project on our traditional territories. Like we just don't have the scientific know-how among those 1,400 people to actually look at that proposal and give it a real assessment, let alone all of the specialties one needs to run a kind of a modern government. But that's just to say that I think that while we can sort of talk about the Opaskwayak Cree Nation as a First Nation, its nationness can really only be realized when it's part of a collective of many more First Nations, and that has enough like land and people to be able to actually do the technical parts of governing. And the problem, what stands between us and that is that we tend still to talk about rights and rights regimes, and the way the Crown recognizes or accords rights. And what we actually need to get to is where the Crown is recognizing, that Aboriginal order of governance as being the thing that gets to hand out the rights. Like that we need to get to that sort of parallel level of respect. And that's what will allow, I think, that nation-to-nation relationship to be realized. Not the nationness, but the governance.
Thank you. I believe that you are Otis, is that correct?
Yeah, that's me.
Would you like to ask a question?
Well, that's why I'm here, yes. Okay, so throughout this you mentioned that there's specific definitions for Aboriginal peoples and Indians and the Inuit. And then you spent a long time also talking about Métis and what rights they sort of have sovereignty to. How are Métis people defined in a way? Because I sort of understand how Indians and Aboriginal people are defined, but I don't think I quite get Métis, because I know Métis for the French word is something like half-breed, something like that, but I don't know exactly how that translates into the people.
Sure. Thank you, Otis. So again, sort of to the extent that people want to call themselves Métis or feel strongly that that is their identity, then there are no limits to that. Just go ahead. In terms of being a rights-bearing Métis person, so what is it? What's the difference between just feeling Métis and being able to say I have a Métis right to do this thing? That was set out in, as I said, a court case called R.V. Powley from the early 2000s. And what the court did was it sort of said, okay, what is a Métis right? Well, a Métis right is a right asserted by a person who's in a contemporary Métis community that has a historic tie to a historic Métis community, and that the right that they're asserting in the present day was a right that was practiced in the past. That's the basic test, and in a sort of analytical kind of legal way, it's a derivative test of the test for Aboriginal rights more broadly. But like I said, Mussel in his scholarship points out that if the court had actually paid attention to the factual background historically, what they would see is that Métis communities were operating within the authority of First Nations, right? And so the way we would define a Métis right then would be to flow it through the First Nation. How that's going to work in practice, I don't actually know, although when we see the Selkirk Treaty, there's a definite way where we're able to see, not only can Métis rights work and flow through a First Nation, but even Métis rights to land can do that. So the test is basically continuity, but in the court's mind, the historic Métis communities, it's okay for some reason for the court if they just pop up in the 1700s, right? Whereas Indian and Inuit rights, they can't pop up. They have to have pre-existed for thousands of years. And so that's an incoherence in the way the court sets out the rights. And I worry that it makes Métis rights as presently conceived unjustifiable and so at risk. And what I think we should try to do is to find a firm, sort of legal and logical basis for those rights to flow and exist.
Mercy. That's thank you, but in mischief.
Otis,
Very good,
Otis, I'd just say another great book to help you understand the Métis is Jean Taillet's book, The Northwest is Our Mother.
Oh, it's on our shelf under the window.
Yeah, I keep seeing it.
Yeah, I think you'll like it. So the first person at this microphone on the ground floor.
My question related to our Métis brethren. If I understand what you're saying, outside of the Selkirk Treaty, where magically a right is created, they have no basis to ask for land. although they've been occupying land.
I wouldn't say that they have no basis. I think that the Selkirk Treaty is
It's a clear
easy
one,
because
yes.
we have it all in writing, right? But I could imagine communities in Ontario that could point to agreements with First Nations that involved settling parts of the land, occupying them exclusively. And in that case, it seems like the Métis could definitely make out a case for land rights. It's just that I don't think it should count that the connection to the ancient historical community you have is one that arrived in the 1750s. I think you need to ground that to a much older claim to land. And I think that's possible to do in many places. But it is, in fact, it is a more stringent test than the test as currently exists. But I think it's one that I, as a legal scholar, can make sense of so that all of those rights stand on the same basis. They're all rights because they attach to these much longer ancient claims.
So this sort of a originalist view of things. If it hadn't been decided by a First Nation formally that the Métis should have claims to a piece of the land, as in the Selkirk thing.
Yeah, and I could imagine that they might even like maybe there is no historical basis, or it's the historical basis is obscure, but you could imagine the Métis community and a First Nation community coming to a present day agreement about land allotment.
But I understand if the Métis get land, it's because it's being taken from a First Nation. Well, the government, if it's settling up and giving out land, will only be given land that has somehow already been taken from First Nations.
Yeah, and that's why I think the Crown being the one who's giving out the rights is the problem, right? That they are necessarily taking from someone else.
Well, no, they've already taken it.
Pardon me?
They've already taken it. The Crown would be giving away Crown land that had already been alienated from the First Nations, from the original
Sure, I mean,
owners.
much of it is subject to claims, and so it's, I would say that
Okay,
while
so
the Crown
competing claims.
has it, they don't have clear and free title over it. It's still contested in many areas.
But it seems ironic, doesn't it, or not attractive, that the First Nations and the Métis should be competing.
No, I see now they're competing, right? Because we're both like going to the government going, please me, not that guy, me, I want that. What I'm saying is no, we should work together. Like we should line up our historic claims and work together, First Nations and Métis people, to make coherent claims over land bases that are legitimately belonging to Métis.
As long as a Métis, I acknowledge that any claim I have is contingent on some First Nations recognition of my claim. Interesting.
I think that's basically the way I can understand and make sense of it. And again, I think that is a claim that can actually quite easily be made out in many, many places. Perhaps more easily even than the existing Pauli test, and certainly one that actually makes sense both sort of legally and historically, at least to me.
A question at the back, and then I'll get you at the front.
Yeah, I have like two questions. Do you feel that in Canada, the issue of Indigenous or not is really the similar questions that Europe is facing now with mass migrations, and this is globally, even in China, mass migrations causing nationalities to leave their original spots of origination and go to other places. And they're saying, well, no, well, recognize us as a nationality. And I think Canada, by recognizing First Nations, actually is a step because you're recognizing them as a nation. Remember long ago, Jews in Europe, there was debates in every country whether they were a nationality at all or whether it's just a religion and therefore deserved no recognition. So that's the first question, is what do you think about Canada and the Indigenous issue in Canada compared to what's going on with massive migrations globally?
So let's deal with the first question first.
Okay.
So, I mean, from an Indian perspective, yeah, I think we've been overwhelmed by waves and waves and waves of immigration. You know, I think we've chosen a suboptimal way of sorting through the issues. But I think that maybe Canada is different than many of those other places in that the First Nations identity is so uniquely distinct and different and grounded in completely different kind of cultural realities that I think it's easier to maintain the assertion that that's a distinct thing that needs to be differentiated, as opposed to like when Italians cross over into Switzerland, right? Like I can see that maybe you don't like it, but it doesn't seem like it raises the same level of issue necessarily. So thank you.
Yeah, and the last question is all the different religions now in Canada, it's popular to say the land acknowledgement.
Yeah.
But yet so few religious institutions, individual churches or congregations or whatever, do not establish relationships with the nations that are in their land acknowledgement. And that's a failure of faith. What do you think, as from a spiritual point of view, as an Indigenous person?
I'm Cree, actually. Thank you. So I think you're right, absolutely, that it is a failure of the spiritual realm to say the words and not back it with action. I'm not particularly critical of the land acknowledgement in general, even though I think it's sometimes, you know, like you say, it sort of lacks a heart to talk about the people of a land and not have any relationship to them. But I honestly think that the work of the land acknowledgement actually is not about us as adults. What the land acknowledgement has quietly done in the background is we've exposed an entire generation of children to the idea that they are living on Indigenous territories. And that's a sort of background orientation that none of us grew up with. And I think that in the future, that will make it possible for us to talk about these sort of structural changes, because people will have in their mind that's actually the right way. That's the way we should be thinking about it. So, you know, although I think we could all do a better job on the land acknowledgement in all kinds of ways, I'm okay to let it go, because I kind of think that the secret work that it's doing is that background work whose fruits we will realize in the coming generations, but unlikely this one.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm an admirer of Buffy St. Marie, and I think she has done wonderful things in her life. And I was very sad to see the way she was treated. Mm-hmm. I didn't think she deserved the opprobrium that she received, and I didn't see why people were so disappointed in her, because I felt that all her motives were pretty pure.
Yeah, so thank you, that it's a complicated issue, of course, or it can be made to feel simple. And I think the people who are really angry are among those people. Yeah. But, so again, I think, how do we think about what our identity is? And so with Buffy St. Marie, again, remember, her claim was not that she was Indigenous, right? Her claim was that she was adopted into a specific community. And that was the basis of the assertion of her identity. And I think that is actually the right basis for all of us to think about our identities. What community claims me? That's the legitimate claim to an Indian First Nations identity, is that there are people in that community who recognize you're a part of, right? And that community itself is an ancient one. And so I think people are it's okay to be outraged with Buffy St. Marie. You can be angry as you want. But I think for me, until I see the people of that reservation rejecting her claims, then they seem as legitimate as my claims, because the basis of my claim is that the people of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation know me and accept me. And so to the extent that that is the basis of her claim, it seems legitimate to me.
So just before Stephen, there's two questions. Stephen and Joe has a question. I just want to remind you that there are Valley of the Birdtail books are for sale at the back when we break for coffee and cookies. Joe, please go ahead.
I first of all just want to thank you for, I just feel like my brain has just expanded like threefold. And so there's a lot to ponder, but I do have a couple questions. I remember when we were still using the term, Aboriginal, and it was somebody who, I don't remember which nation they were connected with from BC, and she told me that they were offended by that term because it was more indicative of people from Australia, and promoted the idea of Indigenous because it has that connection to the land meaning, so that somebody who's connected with a particular territory and a particular land. And so, many of us here switched because we thought Aboriginal was offensive because it doesn't mean this land. Mm-hmm. So that's my first question, and I have another one.
Okay, so thank you. No, that's so let me do the Australia part first. So Australian Indigenous people, small I Indigenous people, are Aborigines, right? And so and we refer to them as Aborigines. Because Aboriginal refers to the three groups all at once, the offensive thing is to describe someone as an Aboriginal in the same way that you would describe an Australian as an Aborigine. Mm-hmm. That person in British Columbia, would probably prefer, instead of Indigenous, that you referred to her actual community, right? So, that's I think the part about Aboriginal that offends people is because for a long time in the early 80s, it got used as a way of describing persons and not sets of peoples. Right, and that is offensive and a misnomer. So I think that's where that confusion started to arise.
Oh, thank you. My second question is more, again, as a settler, feeling that saddened by the tension between people who identify as from Métis and people who identify either Inuit or First Nations. And I keep thinking about who makes these rules? And so often it's white people in power. and that's why I feel sad. So somebody maybe in the 1700s who was from a First Nation ended up starting a family with somebody who's not. And it reminds me of that whole thing in the United States. I'm originally from the United States. How many drops of black blood do you have before you were black? And there's a part of me that just feels like, we're getting into it's not allowing people to be, I'll use myself as an example, partly Irish, partly English, partly this and that. And actually, each of those parts of me are important. Certainly, the parts where I have more connection, I identify with more. But there's something about this kind of thing that makes me sad, because doesn't it, in a way, make us force people to stay in their one community and not to have relationships with people outside? So I don't know, it's not really a question, it's kind of maybe this is because I have a social work brain, and I'm so worried about people feeling like they're on the outs because of something that their ancestors chose to do.
Yeah, so thanks. It's a really interesting question. I think it maybe starts to point out part of the problem of talking about nations but not about governance. And it's not that First Nations cannot, in the present day, adopt new members. It's that they suffer a very serious financial penalty for doing so. And so I could imagine a world where that was not the case, where those present-day communities would be, would have every motive to welcome back those members, to draw them in again, and because we would want more tax-paying citizens, right? We'd want that brain power to be able to do those studies. So, and it is the case that we are all made up of constituent parts. I don't know that any of us is pure anymore. My own self, I am, on my mother's side, definitely Cree from OCN. My father's side is a lot more complicated. We suspect he was hearing Michif when he was growing up as a little kid. He had relations in the Dog Creek Reserve. But when I was born, my father was in the Air Force, and so I was born in West Germany, as it was at the time. And I was really sick, and they didn't know why. And one thing they noticed was that I had a very low iron count. So they kept shoving iron in me, and I got sicker and sicker. And so out of desperation, they ran just like this crazy wide field of study, tests, and they discovered that I had something called thalassemia minor. Thalassemia minor is not rare, but it's not uncommon. It's a blood disorder common among people in the Mediterranean. And the nature of the disorder is that your hemoglobin is misshapen. So instead of being sort of roundy oval, it's kidney-shaped. And that difference in shape is what because the hemoglobin carries the iron. So that difference in shape is what explains the lower iron count. And the reason I kept getting sicker is because the problem wasn't that I didn't have enough iron, it's that I had all the iron I could, and that was just less than other people. So one of the things that happens at this moment where this is revealed to my father is he says, who in your family has Middle Eastern blood? And my father says, no one. And the doctor says, you better make some calls. So my father calls back to his aunt, and his aunt, in this sort of moment of 1970s decorum, explains that my father's mother had a relationship, and perhaps a non-consensual one, with a Syrian man in the 1930s in Saskatoon, which sounds completely absurd, except that I have the blood. Mm-hmm. Could be Syrian, could be Jewish, who knows? So I carry that now as part of who I am. My children have both been blessed with thalassemia minor, so it extends to them. And yet they also carry their mother's Scottish and Irish heritage. And within that, they both think of themselves, I think, as being Cree peoples. Mm-hmm. Cree is a culture, and these are all cultures. They're all learnable, which is why I think about a world where what it is to be a member in our communities is to be able to leave Toronto and move to Opaskwayak Cree Nation and learn to speak Cree and get adopted into a clan and marry someone. And people should be able to do that. Our communities should be competitive with other places. But to do that, we need that governance authority to be able to determine new members in a way that's not costly to the communities themselves.
Thank you. That really helps a lot.
Thank you.
Stephen.
It seems to me that decolonization is a long, arduous journey, both in terms of laws, but also the way of seeing and the language we use. And I wonder what this means in terms of where we are as a country, what it means for the Indian Act.
So thank you, Steve. And I have to say, this just occurred to me, like I've been kind of uncomfortable with colonial and decolonial for a while. Like I did my undergraduate degree in British Columbia in the late 1990s. And at that time, I don't know if any of you were in university then, there was no university classroom you could walk into where the topic of discussion was not postmodernism. Everything was understood through the lens of postmodernism. It was god-awful. It's a terrible time to be alive and a student. That has thankfully all gone away, mostly, but it has been replaced with this culture of anti-colonialism. You cannot walk into a university classroom at the undergraduate level without whatever that topic is going through this lens of decolonialism. And it's never, like, when we say colonial and decolonial, the assumption is that we're both thinking the same thing, right? Like the word means what to you, what it words to me. And my issue with that is that what people mean is they mean like this huge, it's economic, it's social, it's political, it's historical, it's biblical, it's all these things. And we might not actually both be thinking of it the same way. So my preference is for like, let's talk about the thing we're talking about. So if we're talking about patriarchy, let's talk about patriarchy and not also call it colonialism. And the thing I was just thinking of, like, the problem with decolonialism is what then? Right? Like, what, like, how is that not possibly part of the conversation? Like, what is that supposed to leave us with? What are we supposed to fill that vessel with? And the fact that we're not talking about that at all makes me feel like it's not an actual project that people are really involved in. Right? Because and the same is with the Indian Act. People say we should get rid of the Indian Act. Like, and then what? Right? Like, until we need to actually see that the consequence of these ideas is that there's a next day. And what are we going to do in that next day? And my view is if we can figure out what the next day looks like, we can actually figure out how to get there. Right? The problem is we've been focused on the deprocessing, the decolonizing, and not the how do we get to that next day where Indigenous nations are strong as governments and they're respected as equals of provinces and the federal government. Like, that's ultimately what we need to get to. I don't know if that's decolonized. It's something better than what we have now. I don't know if it's decolonial.
Well, we couldn't end on a better note.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really fun. Thank you.
So I think many of you would like to speak with Professor Sanderson individually, so please head to the back. There's coffee and cookies for you. And I would like to thank all of the people who organized today's event. Stephen Allen, the kitchen crew, Morgan. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a splendid weekend.
Yes, and thank you so much for coming out. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, you just really opened so many areas of consideration.